Right. While Anand is walking up, let me tell you a little bit about him. Anand is one of India's leading data scientists, and his role at Gramina involves translating technology and innovation into processes and products that transform businesses. Founded in 2010, Gramina advises clients on data-driven leadership, specifically in data management, analytics, dashboard design, and data visualization. Gramina works with global Fortune 100 customers and helps unlock hidden insights from data using cutting-edge visualizations to develop foresight for critical business decisions. Anand's talk is titled Data as Kingmaker.
2013, and we said, let's take a look at what we can figure out with election data. I mean, what can we learn about democracy in action? See, the thing is, the problem begins with the way in which the data is available. The Election Commission effectively has data in PDFs. That's pretty much all of the data. And now you've got to take all of these PDFs, and there's millions of pages of these, and convert it into some kind of structured text, which fortunately it's possible to do. These are not scanned photos, or well, most of them are not scanned photos. Actually, the 1992 Gujarat election results that are officially there on the Election Commission website are scanned photographs. So that's a bit of a nightmare. But barring that, most of it is fortunately at least text, which means that you can convert that with some amount of effort into a structured form that's tabular and take it into Excel. So which we did, and it took only about a month or two to get all of the data into a kind of structured format like this. And at that point, we found something interesting. We found that India has approximately 2000 parliamentary constituencies. That doesn't sound quite right. It's closer to 540. So where did we go wrong here? Well, you can see the problems. The problem is spelling mistakes. The official names of the constituencies in the official document is, depending on the year, BTM layout with a full stop at the end or without a full stop at the end. Atni spelt with an A or without an A. Arbhavi or Arabhavi spelt with or without an A. Now, we clearly have problems, right? And this is the official source. So it's not as if there's anything that we can do to beat it. Is there a way in which we can beat this pattern? Well, see, the trouble is that we as humans are pretty bad with numbers in general. I'm going to do a small quiz with this group. I'm going to show you a table of numbers, and I'm going to ask you 3 seconds, and you're going to get 30 seconds, 10 seconds per question. 3 very simple questions. Okay. You don't need to shout out the answer, just remember it, write it down. It's just 3 simple numbers. Let's give it a shot. Okay. Here's a table of numbers. Your time starts now. How many numbers are above 100? Just remember it, write it down, whatever. How many are below 10? And which quarter has the highest total? That was 30 seconds. Let's do a quick poll. How many numbers above 100? 3, 4, 5, 7. Any takers for 8, 9? Okay, how many numbers below 10? 3, 5, 9. Okay, so somewhere between 3 and 9, somewhere between 3 and 7. And which quarter has the highest total? Bottom right. I'm hearing any other corners? Top left. Heard a top right there. So, okay, I've heard 3 of the 4 quarters so far. Now, the thing is, we are good with patterns, with visuals. So, let's do the same thing again. This time you can shout out the answer. It's going to be fairly trivial. I'm going to do some very simple highlighting on this. How many numbers are above 100? How many numbers are below 10? And which has the highest total? Bottom right. Now, in the second set, I flashed it for approximately about 1/3 of the time that I flashed it the first time. Not only was it taking you less time to figure out the answer, because the answer was pretty much staring at you in the eye, but it also effectively ended up having a lot less variance. It's unlikely that you would have guessed any number between 3 and 9. And which begs the question, right? If you're doing some analysis and at the end of it, somebody is going to guess the answer is somewhere between 3 and 9, what's the point of having done the analysis at all? And if we as human beings are much better at visual patterns, then why not present it in a way that makes sense as visual patterns? Why not do this all the time? So that's exactly what we did to the data cleansing exercise as well, which is to say, let's take the same table and start showing the patterns of these numbers, and these numbers here represent the total number of candidates that stood for elections in each of these years. So in Ireland, for instance, there were people that stood for election, 5 candidates in 1957, 3 candidates in 1962, then 2, then 3, and then suddenly there were no candidates until 2008 and 2013, when suddenly we have a large number of candidates. But here we have candidates standing in exactly the same years where there were no candidates here. So I don't even need to recognize that this could be a spelling mistake of this. I can look at this pattern and say that this particular constituency is perhaps this constituency. I can do that for Arbhavi and Arbhavi. The pattern just clearly fits. Atni and Atani, it just clearly fits. BTM layout, well, we have only 2 data points, but it still clearly fits. So which means that I have a visual way of combining these, which goes beyond the simple alphabetical ordering. And we started doing that. This helped us spot one such. For instance, Kundapur is the same as Kundapura, and we wouldn't have figured out the C and the K swap just by looking at it alphabetically. And there were several others. The most striking one that we had was Bandar was renamed to Machilipatnam. If you look it up on Wikipedia, it will tell you about the history of the place and why the Turkish name is Bandar and why the Indian name is Machilipatnam. But the constituency was in official records called Bandar and became Machilipatnam. And without this, there's just no way we would have figured out that these two are in fact exactly the same constituency, just renamed. And it's not just constituencies that get renamed. Parties are misspelt. So MADMK and MAMAK and MDMK are actually the same party, just spelled different ways in different years because of how it's written in Tamil. Party names changed. The AIA-DMK became the ADMK and was at one point the ADK. Parties restructure. So what was the Indian National Congress became the Indian National Congress Indra, or rather split into it, and then effectively became the de facto party. So which means that these should really be considered the same party. Constituency names can be misspelled in a variety of different ways, which we've seen. And some of these get trickier to spot just by manual analysis, which is where fortunately machine learning comes into play. What we can do is toss all of these constituency names into a system that says cluster all of these together based on the spellings, and the system tells us that Devarkonda, for example, could be spelled Devarakonda or Devarkonda, Sullurpet, Sullurpet, Sullurpeta, Chinnur, Bhadrachalam. All of these sound similar enough that the algorithm says maybe they should be grouped, and all it takes is one check mark by a human to say yes, these are in fact the same, which solves the problem of finding bad data or finding misspelled data. But how do you correct it? The good part is at large scale, data can correct itself. If you did a simple Google search to ask for the spelling of put in both spellings of Bhadrachalam, right? One of them will have about 14 lakh hits, another has 14,000 hits. You know which is the correct spelling. The simple truth is that the correct answer is used more often than the wrong answer. And if it isn't, well, you have bigger problems than data correction. So that's a different story. But what this does is gives us the ability to autocorrect simply based on popularity and a few other techniques. So now this was the second layer. Having extracted all of it, we then started cleaning it, and now we get to some reasonably clean data with which we can start using these results. But before I go on to how we use the results, let me talk a little more about these visual patterns. It's not as if these visual patterns are applicable in this narrow domain of either elections or, for that matter, in data cleansing. You see them everywhere. Let's take energy. We were working with the state electricity board, and they said, see, we have a problem. We want to go for automated meter readings. And the trouble is the union is saying, no, we have several reasons why, but one of our reasons is that there's a lot of fraud. But we don't have systematic evidence for fraud. We have anecdotal evidence. Even if we catch 100 people that are committing fraud, they say, look, we are 100,000 people strong. You can't throw away an organization of 100,000 people because there's 0.1% committing fraud. That's ridiculous, and that's true. So can you give me systematic evidence for fraud? So we did what we usually do, which is just look for visual patterns. And when we plotted the total number of people that have meter readings of 0, 1, 2, 3, so the height of each bar represents the number of people with meter readings of 0, 1, 2, all the way up to 50, 100, 200, and so on, we find that there are spikes. And some of these spikes are pretty odd. The largest spikes are at 50 units, 100 units, 200 units, 300 units, and these are exactly the slab boundaries. Now, it turns out that if your meter reading is just above the slab boundary, which means at 51, then you get into a higher slab, which means that your entire meter reading goes into a higher base and you pay a whole lot more. So, there is a lot of economic incentive to stay at the slab boundary or just below. Now, there are two ways you can do this. One, every day watch the meter. If it hits 50 or if it hits 100, switch off lights and fans, no more electricity for the rest of the month. Option 1. Option 2, some money changes hands. So, it was easy in this particular case to demonstrate that there is a decent amount of fraud that is happening, and we could even measure the amount of fraud. But what confused us was why there were spikes at 10, 20, 30, 40 and so on. Nobody is going to pay to round off their meter readings to 10, 20. It's the same slab, it's 1 unit, it's not a big deal. So, we were pretty confused until the Energy Commissioner said, boss, don't go in a single track mind. This is not fraud, this is laziness. These are the meter readings written down by people who never went to take a meter reading. They're just cooking up numbers, and when people cook up numbers, they cook up round numbers. So he said, no, you've given me two reasons, not just fraud, I can also book them for laziness. And you've also told me who are the people that are more likely to be lazy. And see, the nature of the fraud, the other question that we had was, is this systematic? Is it like the guy who comes to take a meter reading gets a monthly contract, or is it more in the nature of a daily contract? Now, all the initial evidence was more in the nature of a perpetual contract. Like the general understanding is that you get some money and adjust the bill. But there was some evidence against it as well. So, for instance, we found that each of these rows is the meter reading of one person. So, let's take this row. This person gets meter readings of 200, 200, 200, 200, 200, 200, 200, 200. This is real data. Now, how likely is this? Now, this seems to indicate that there is some kind of perpetual scheme going on. But what struck us was why there were some gaps here. So, for example, why is this suddenly 350? Why is this suddenly 250? Why is this suddenly, I mean, it's still rounded off, and that feels odd, but the 350 in particular was quite confusing. So, again, we went to the Energy Commissioner and said something seems odd here. Visually we spotted a pattern that seems to be an anomaly. So, he looked at the name, he said, okay, I know this family. Okay. Turns out that there was a huge wedding at their place, and the bill, he says, would in all probability have come to several thousand rupees. We have a policy of not auditing anyone who's anyway in the highest slab. The lineman must have gone to them and told them, ma'am, please, this month let me put you in the highest slab, otherwise both of us are going to be in trouble. Okay, that works. It works that way as well. We also started looking at how much fraud there is. So, for instance, you see these spikes, right? The amount of that spike in each region and each month is something that we can quantify. So, when we did that, we said, let's see where exactly the fraud is. So, when we took one particular city, and within that, each of the sections within that city, for each of the months, what is the amount by which these spikes are exceeding the norm? Sometimes it's as high as 100%, 110%, 120%, etc. And sometimes it's pretty low. And you can see a broad pattern here as well. There are some regions that have a lot of fraud, some don't. It turns out that in the winter months, there's a little less fraud, fewer ACs running, so you can guess that it's in a hot region. But this was the oddest one. There was one particular month in which there was negative fraud. Fewer cases, spikes dipping downwards than the other way around. And almost exactly 3 months later, it suddenly spiked up, and just in this particular section, and then continued as normal. So, the Energy Commissioner looked up the records and found that there was one particular section manager who, where did that go? Okay, one particular section manager who arrived in that section in the month when it dipped, 3 months later gets transferred out. So, not only do you know where what's happening, but who's causing it to go which way as well, purely through visual patterns. Or let's take another example. The Tamil Nadu Education Department said, we want to find out what's happening from a marks perspective. So, we said, okay, let's plot the marks. How many students get what marks? How many students get 0 marks, 1 mark, 2 marks, all the way up to 100 marks? And you can see that it's roughly a normal curve. Very few students get high marks, very few students get low marks, most of them are in the middle. But you'll notice a spike at 35 marks. You know what's happening. The kind English teachers decide that no students shouldn't fail if they get 34 or 33 or whatever. Let's scoop them up and give them that grace mark. But observe that the kind English teachers are not consistently kind. There are some students who fail at 34, which means that there are some teachers who say, no, you will get only 34. Why should you pass? So at least in English, there is room for prayer in the morning if you're a borderline student. It's touch and go. But if it's social science, you don't need to pray. Nobody flunks between 30 and 35. And the education department said, look, we swear we have no policy of moderation around this. Whatever is happening because the teachers have gotten together. Now, for some reasons, the social science teachers seem to have gotten their act together and the English teachers haven't. Or, well, whatever it is. Mathematics is the other anomaly. Again, no need to pray. But this spike, incidentally, I've chopped it off for consistency with the previous slides. It actually goes well beyond the ceiling. The amount of students, there are more than 100,000 students that got exactly 35 marks. That's pretty odd. But the hidden anomaly here is the spike at 100. And I've seen this explained in a couple of different ways. So it's not coming down. There are more students getting 100 than 99 or 98 or 97 or 96 or 95, which is striking. And one explanation that I've heard is mathematics is an objective subject. That is, the teacher can defend that this answer is correct and therefore I will give you in fact 100 marks and I don't have a problem because heck I can prove to anyone who questions that the answer is correct. But the other reason that I've heard is equally interesting, which is that mathematics is bimodal. Some people get it, some people don't. It's almost as if there's a group of people who are, well, for lack of a better word, let's say geniuses, or who really understand mathematics that are writing the same exam, as the majority that don't really understand it, who are still writing the same exam. So it's really two normal curves. And you can't award somebody who really gets it 110 or 120 because the paper is capped at so much. So what's happening is that these two normal curves are getting chopped off on the right, and those students who get it are effectively the ones that are crowding on the right-hand side. Possible. This kind of a behavior we see in computer science as well, which studies also show is bimodal. But the weirdest pattern that I've seen, that's in the ICSE 2013 marks. No student in the entire country got 93 marks, nor 91, nor 89, nor any of these blank spots. We still don't know why. We published it. Jerry Arathun, the chairman of ICSE, comes out with a bland sounding statement saying, we use a policy of normalization that leads to this kind of a distribution. We have no idea what that means. And it vanished after that year. After the amount of press coverage that this got, that pattern vanished and all marks became apparent. But that year was a fascinating year. Not just in ICSE, in CBSE as well. CBSE, the interesting thing was not the spike at 33, which is the corresponding pass mark in CBSE, but the spike at 95, which beats that. And this isn't students getting pushed up, it's students getting pushed down. Took us a year to solve that mystery. We finally managed to speak to someone at CBSE who showed us a memo, which was pretty interesting. It said, there is a lot of attention in the press on the percentage of students scoring above 95%. We want to make sure that our system of evaluation is fair. That's all it said. Which I learned later on is official speak for saying, find all the students who got above 95, get them down. I don't want to see this in the press again. But that's patterns. Let's get to elections and how we started applying it. So we took all of this data. Our first election coverage was in 2014 for the parliamentary elections. We did that with CNN, IB, and it was a pretty momentous occasion, at least for me. It marked my first surreptitious national television appearance. So that's me in the background who snuck behind and just called home saying, folks, tune on to CNN, IB, and you'll see me on TV. But this was interesting because what we did was try to make a change from the anchor reading a prepared script to becoming an analyst. Can they analyze things live? Can they take a question and come up with an answer immediately? And the way we did that was put together an interface that looked like this. So, for example, one of the questions that Bhupendra Chaubey was asked was, okay, so BJP is, the way you read this is pretty obvious. It's the alliance colors, or in this case, the party colors. So the question he was asked was, now BJP is clearly sweeping, but are there cases where they are losing? In fact, is there any place where BJP has lost to the Congress? So what Bhupendra Chaubey did was, so let's look at where BJP was the party that won in 2014. Congress was the party that won in 2014, where BJP was winning the last year. And it turns out that there are only 7 such seats. And if you look at that list of places, There's one in Assam, there's Durg in Chhattisgarh, there's 4 in Karnataka and 1 in Punjab. So, short answer, not many places where Congress has actually beaten BJP in this election, but there are 4 of them in Karnataka. So, if there is a wave that's going in the opposite direction, this is pretty much the only place. Another question that came up was, are there any places where, well, clearly BJP is not, the question was, is BJP also winning in the Muslim dominated areas? So, Bhupendra Chaubey said, okay, let's look at the percentage Muslims where it's 40% plus Muslims and there are 22 of those seats. Out of those, how many were won by BJP? And the short answer is only 3, and those turned out to be in 2 in UP and 1 in Ladakh, and UP is of course their stronghold, so it makes sense, and in Ladakh there's just one place where they managed to turn things around. So short answer, nope, BJP is not winning in any of the Muslim areas, and these were questions that were coming up live, which meant a major shift as far as we were concerned in the way in which live events were running. But the most interesting question that came up, at least in my opinion, was where did the largest number of candidates contest? So, we looked at that map. This incidentally is for Tamil Nadu, where in 1967, each of these circles represents one of the constituencies where people were contesting. So, this is Rasipuram with 6 candidates and eventually DMK won, that indicates the color. We can change the year. So, in 1971, we see that there was a bit of a change, and here suddenly in 1977, there are more candidates. That's represented by the size. So, for example, in Male Malayanur, there were 9 candidates that stood for election, and overall there is a color shift as well. This is the time when ADMK came in. Let's move on. 1980, not much of a change, but 1984 we suddenly see that in Maduranthakam there were 90 candidates. That's a long list. Okay? You have to go through 3 or 4 sheafs of paper to find the candidate. 1989 overall spurt but no outliers. 1991 is pretty interesting. Pallipet with 264 candidates and Avarakuruchi with 249 candidates. So now it's not a bunch of sheets, it's almost like a mini booklet that you have to flip through to find your candidate. Right? But all of this pales in comparison with the 1996 elections of Modakuruchi, where 1033 candidates contested for the same seat. 1033. That's not a booklet, that's a book. It's probably the telephone directory of Modakuruchi. And if you look at the names that appeared there, right, this is what it looked like. Palnisamy K, 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 Palnisamy K. I mean, if you're a Palnisamy K, how do you figure out which Palnisamy K you are to vote for yourself? Which seems to have been a problem because as many as 88 candidates got 0 votes, meaning after having stood for elections, they didn't even vote for themselves. That's the only way you can get 0 votes, by not voting for yourself. We finally figured out what happened here. There was a farmers' protest, and there was actually somebody who literally stood outside the Election Commission office and asked people, look, here's 500 rupees, go and register, and we want to protest. And this happened in 2 other places as well, Nalgaon and, Belgaon and Nalgonda. There were 2 other places where this happened, and obviously because it costs only 500 rupees to get in. So the Election Commission immediately changed their rules. 1996 onwards, it's not 500 rupees that you need, it's 25,000 rupees that you need to stand for elections. And you can see the impact. The number of candidates that stood for elections up to 1995 just skyrocketed and then shot down. But you can see the impact is steadily starting to go up, and in 2014 it was even higher. We'll probably see similar effects in this year, where the number of candidates is likely to be much higher than it was even in the last election. Okay, so if money is a problem, then does the wealth of the candidate make a difference? Does it actually matter who is rich enough for them to win? But before we start talking about wealth, right, I mean, then we're going to get into crores and hundreds of crores and stuff like that, which, I mean, I guess for this audience are sets of numbers that you're probably extremely familiar with, but the vast majority of the people are not. So let's start taking a measure of how much these are. In the time when we had 1,000 rupee notes, that's how large 1 lakh was. That's 10 lakhs. You can still kind of hold it in your hand. 1 crore size of a small briefcase. 10 crores, yeah, you'll have to have like a couple of briefcases to hold it, but you can still just barely lift 10 crores. 100 crores, that's huge. That will form a crate on the stage. 1,000 crores, that's going to pile up almost up to this high, and it's going to be pretty vast. 10,000 crores will fill more than this stage above my height. That's just to give you a sense of how much money there is. And well, when you think about it, right, it's not that much volume-wise. It's a hell of a lot of money. So when we look at the wealth of candidates in the last election, Nandan Nilekani had over 7,000 crores, just one person who was richer than the rest of his party and few other parties combined, all put together. It just completely dwarfed the election. Did it make a difference to the election result? No, as you well know. But it was odd to see the sheer distribution of wealth across. Not just distribution of wealth, distribution in general was pretty interesting. If you look at the total number of candidates that had, if you look at the total number of police cases that were filed against individual candidates, the party that had the largest number of police cases filed against it in total was the Aam Aadmi Party, which again is odd. I mean, wasn't their entire platform kind of going the other way? But then, to be fair, it was really two people who tilted the entire thing in their favor. Dr. Uday Kumar with 382 cases against them and Pushparayan with 380 cases. These are activists. I mean, I guess it's their job description to get arrested or something. But they've been pretty active. To file 382 cases, it means that for the last 7 years, the police must have been filing a case every single week against them. Right? That's the kind of volume that we are talking about here. So now, what about the parties? We've talked about the candidates. How successful are parties in general? Well, one thing is easy to figure out. Well, first, let's start by looking at the strength of the winning parties. If we look at the history of elections from, well, the very first time we had elections all the way to now, the x-axis here is the vote share. How popular is the party among the people? And the y-axis is the vote share. How many seats did they win? In the first 2 decades, the 1950s and the 1960s, Congress had a majority in terms of number of seats, but did not win more than half the votes. The next 2 decades, Congress, and in one instance, Janata Party, won both a majority in terms of number of seats and in terms of the number of people that voted for them. In the 1990s and 2000s, no party won an absolute majority. We just did not get it, and incidentally, by and large, there was also no majority in terms of vote share. This decade, there has been a reversal, at least for now. And from what we are hearing so far, it doesn't look like it's going to last, but we now again are in the time when there is a majority. But is this strength of majority driven by some factors? Let's begin by just looking at the parties themselves. Which has been the most successful party in terms of the percentage of conversions, the number of elections that candidates have stood in and won? That's an easy one, Congress. It's got almost 50% success rate, meaning that in the history of elections, out of every 2 elections that Congress has fielded a candidate in, it has won. What about the opposite? Which is the least successful party? Now that's tricky, right? Because there are enough parties that have exactly 0 wins. But is there a party that has had a huge number of losses, an unimaginable number of losses? Turns out that there is. There is a party, or was, called the Doordarshi Party. In 1984, they contested in, well, most of Gujarat, UP, with 97 candidates, and they had exactly 0 wins. They didn't win in a single place. They didn't give up. They were persistent, right? I mean, I'm defining it that way. So in 1989, they tried again with 298 candidates across most of North India. At this point, they were the second largest party in terms of the number of candidates. Only Congress had more candidates than this party. And they won exactly 0 seats, not a single seat. They didn't give up. In 1991, they contested again, this time in 321 constituencies, once again making them the second largest party, perhaps even the largest, I'm not entirely sure, and won exactly 0 seats. There isn't any other party that even comes close to this record. But what makes it even more interesting is that not only were they never the winner, they were never even the runner-up, ever. At best, they were number 3, and that was largely in constituencies that had 3 candidates. That's a remarkable feat. So let's talk about, what about these candidate names? Now, this particular topic has been of particular interest in the last election. See, it turns out that you usually don't have duplicate names for candidates. At least from 1989 or 1991, there hasn't been a single candidate with duplicate names until 2014. In the last election, though, we had some pretty interesting scenarios with duplicate names. There were 11 Chandulal Sahus in Mahasamund in Chhattisgarh. 11 Chandulal Sahus, who was incidentally the sitting MP. There were 5 Lakhanlal Sahus in Bilaspur. And there were 2 Hema Malinis in Mathura, there were 3 Jarnail Singhs in Delhi, and you see a pretty long list where candidates, there's duplicate names of candidates, incidentally, where also these candidates are the sitting MPs. Now, obviously, if there's a candidate whose name is the same as the sitting MP, the intent is probably to confuse the voter, and if it's happening this often, it's clearly going to be affecting the parties that hold the incumbent MP. And you'll notice one party is conspicuously absent in this list. I'm going to say no more. I'll just leave it at that. But if you want to form any conspiracy theories, I'll leave that to you. And if you didn't get it, I'm just going to keep quiet about it anyway. But since we are talking about names, right? One of the things that has always puzzled at least me since I was a kid was the people kept saying, I forgot something else. We started analyzing names in a little more detail and started asking questions like, is there a pattern among names? Are there some states with long names? Question for you, which state do you think has candidates with the longest names? AP, okay. Tamil Nadu? No. AP was my guess as well. Kerala? Not a chance. You don't know Kerala. Turns out that that's the average length of names, at least according to the electoral rolls. You'll see that Andhra does have long names, but not as much as, what did it do? Not as much as Gujarat. But the reason for it is aliases. For those of you who can't read the name from the back, let me try reading it out from here. So there's Imran Gulab Nabi Ajmeri, whose alias is Naik Soinade Ashikde Pavaiya. I don't see anything similar between those names. But it's a long name with a long alias. And there's nothing to beat Gujarat when it comes to the size of these aliases. But it's not just the aliases. There's in Uttaranchal, Garhwal, for instance, has titles. Major General Retired Bhuvan Chandra Khanduri AVSM. And there's a whole bunch of these that add to the size as well. But the oddest one that I saw was in Raipur, where there's Kabir Bakht Aswant Das Sahu, Karorpati Jeevan Bima Agent. That is his official name as per the electoral records, and I wonder what will happen if he gets elected. Right? And since we are talking about names, as a kid, I was told, look, your name starts with A. So you're going to be called upon early, and therefore, that means that on the one hand, you will be very unprepared for most things, so you'll score low marks. On the other hand, they said, but that means that you're going to be really on your feet most of the time, have to think quick, and therefore you will get high marks later on. Decided to put this to the test. I had school marks, as you saw earlier, so I said, okay, which letter scores the highest? Question to you. Do you believe, show of hands, how many people believe that the name of a person makes a difference to their marks? Okay, it's true. How many people think it doesn't make a difference to their marks? Okay, there is a scientific majority out here. Well, turns out that in 2005, the alphabet A had the highest, but then some alphabet has to have the highest. In 2000, the alphabet M had the lowest on average, and this is some kind of a distribution. And it kind of stays stable. Up to 2011, the distribution really doesn't change much. In 2011, for instance, it's swapped between V and A, and the bottom M is still very much there. There isn't that much of a change. There's a certain amount of stability around this, which, if it were random, ought not to be, right? Why is this? So we decided to explore further. We looked at individual names. Each of these boxes represents one student. The size of the box represents the number of students who have that name. So the largest boxes are students named Kumar and Priya respectively. That's the most common name in Tamil Nadu. And the color of the box represents the average marks that they score. So the darker the box, the higher their marks. The lighter the box, the lower their marks. And therefore, let's ask the question, who scores the highest marks in Tamil Nadu? The Jains, the Shahs, and the Agarwals. An average of 88% against a state average of 66%. I mean, that's not beating them. That's like whipping them by 2 orders of magnitude, right? And you can figure out the reasons for it, right? North Indian migrants to South India are likely to be more economically prosperous, likely to have seen the world a bit more, probably children of army parents, merchants, whatever. But here, it's probably the economics and sociology that's playing a part, not numerology, maybe. We also find that girls' names like Sanjana, Harini, Sneha, Pooja, Varshini, Deepthi, Shweta, they tend to score high, classic urban girls' names. And who scores really bad marks? Manikantan, Yelumalai, Venkatesan, Silambarasan, Tirupati, Pandian, classic rural boys' names. So you know what's happening here. Socioeconomic factors are correlated with names. Socioeconomic factors are correlated with marks. Therefore, for all practical purposes, I can easily be misled to believe that names drive marks. But the reality is there is a correlation, if not a causation. Well, if namology does tend to have some significance, what about astrology? Does that also make a difference? Let's find. Okay, quick question. How many people think the sun sign makes an impact to the child's marks? Okay, even fewer. How many people think it doesn't? Okay, very scientific majority who are again wrong. Let's start by looking at the US firstly, before I get into the sun signs. We had effectively 15 years worth of US birth data, every single child's birth. So we said, let's see how the births are just generally distributed. It ought to be random, right? So from January to December across these 15 years, from the 1st of the month to the 30th of the month, is the pattern uniform? No, it is not. The majority of the births happen to be in the second half of September. That's largely driven by, you might have guessed, but the conceptions happening in the winter holidays, 9 months later is when the kids are born. They have a name. These are the winter babies. Now, you will also find, however, that there are very few babies born during the Christmas holidays, during the Thanksgiving holidays, during the New Year holidays, even during their Independence Day holidays. I mean, this half reads like a holiday calendar, not a birth calendar. Again, explainable. High proportion of C-section births where you need doctors and hospitals to be reasonably staffed. Those are the times when hospitals are short-staffed. So move the dates around a little bit, right? Just to make sure that you have enough support when the children are born. But let's not blame just the doctors and hospitals. Notice that there are fewer children born on the 13th of every month. Superstition. You don't want your kids to be born on an unlucky day. But you're perfectly happy for your kid to be born on Valentine's Day, Feb 14th. So if the US can be this superstitious, what's India like? Let's take a look. Before I get there, this is the pattern of marks for children born in various months. On average, children born in June scored the lowest, children born in September scored the highest, and the difference is a whopping 120 marks out of 1200, 10 percentage points, enough to bring the topper down to the 33rd percentile. This was in 2011, same pattern in 2009, 2010. In fact, every year from 2005 to 2016, it's exactly the same pattern. We broke it up by district, same pattern. Broke it up by state, same pattern. Broke it up by gender, by subject, class 10 versus class 12, any which way you slice and dice the data. This is the pattern. Astrology? No. And for those of you who have read Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, you know the theory, right? So the pattern is fairly straightforward. See, schools open around June, July, which means that the June borns just make it into the 6-year age cutoff, and they're typically the youngest in the class. July borns could swing either way. August borns are typically the oldest in the class because their parents are told, no, your child is too young, therefore you don't get admission, come back the next year. The child comes back the next year, is 1 year older than the rest of the class, most mature emotionally, best built physically, and therefore does better in all of the subjects 12 years later. So is our school system doing nothing to bridge the gap? No, if anything, it's becoming worse, because in class 6, this difference of 10 percentage points is only 5 percentage points. So if anything, it's diverging. But let's get back to the pattern of births. So we took the pattern of births in India, and this is the birth pattern in India. Nobody seems to be born in the month of August. One learned person in the media space told me some things about the astrological properties of the month of Vishakha, which I didn't get at all. But I do know that this is school admission data. That's where we got it from. Think about it. You're a parent. Schools open in June, July. Your child is born in August. You're told, come back next year. What do? Fetch the certificates. And I'm not saying that these dates are fudged. Just because there's very few births in July and a high proportion of births in June, notice these dark stripes on the 5th, 10th, 15th, 20th, 25th. Remember, when people cook up numbers, they cook up round numbers. And what does this do to the children? If you overlay the marks of these children, it turns out that the children who say they're born on the 5th, the 10th, the 15th, the 20th, the 25th, they tend to score lower marks. And you know why? Because these, it's not that there's anything astrologically wrong about the 1st of June. It's merely that there's a significantly high proportion of kids whose birthdays has been faked into 1st of June, typically younger kids, and they're suffering as a consequence. In fact, June the 1st is the single most common official birthday in India. Not Jan the 1st, which is surprising because Jan the 1st, there is an official reason for it. The government says in a government school, if the child does not know the date of birth, guess the year and put Jan the 1st as a birthday. That's a rule, documented. And it is only the second most common birthday in India. Thanks to us parents who, well, for those of us who are parents, who, well, want to help our children get into school early. So, we'll just finish and then wrap up and then get there. I'm pretty close to the end. So, that's what's happening here. The last thing that I want to talk about is, see, this, so far we've been exploring patterns of data across, well, mostly politics, education. But data, in my view, is a king maker. But let's also talk about the data about kings themselves. Let's explore the epic of kings, the largest epic in the world, the Mahabharata. He said, what can we learn about politics in the Mahabharata and from the Mahabharata? The way we did that was we took every single chapter in the Mahabharata, so there's 18 chapters, the first chapter, the second chapter, and so on. Each of those are broken up into individual sections, and each of these little boxes represents the length of those individual sections. So this is a pretty small section, this is a medium section, this is a pretty large section, and the individual words in those are fortunately available as an English translation, which has appeared here. We started asking the question, where are people mentioned? So where is Yudhishthira mentioned? Short answer, pretty much everywhere. The entire epic is about Yudhishthira. Each of those little dots is one mention of Yudhishthira, and in this particular place he's mentioned once towards the end. In this one he's mentioned a few times in the middle and a few times towards the end, and so on. And the book is not entirely about, for example, Arjuna, because you see entire sections out here where he's just not mentioned at all. This, incidentally, I realized later on was, so all of this is the war part. I mean, he's like fighting like crazy. But after that, there's a lot of philosophical discussion in the Mahabharata where Yudhishthira is doing a puja and, well, talking philosophy. A lot more boring than you might normally think the epic is. But what this did was gave us an insight into one thing. We could take a character like Nala, for example, and say, now Nala is mentioned only in these spots, nowhere else in the epic, which means that there is a short story about Nala and he's a peripheral character, nothing more than that. I could take another character like, let's say, Damayanti, and infer that Nala and Damayanti are mentioned in the same story. They are therefore more tightly related than, let's say, Nala and Subhadra, who is mentioned in some completely different spots, which allows me to get a proximity metric, meaning I can see how close people are to each other. So we said, let's explore that. This is the proximity relationship of the top 30 characters in the epic. And clearly, Yudhishthira is right in the middle talking to everybody. There's Bhima, who's talking to a lot of people. Pandu is a pretty central character. Krishna is obviously a central character. And there are peripheral characters like Parva, who's largely talking to Vaishampayana. There's Gandhari, who's mostly talking to just three people, Kunti, Vidura, and Dhritarashtra. It's kind of interesting that she's talking more to her brother-in-law than her husband. But well, since we are talking about it, let's take the politics of Draupadi, right? 5 husbands. Let's see who's closest to Draupadi. Sahadeva is not too far, Nakula is not too far, Bhima is not too far, Yudhishthira is a bit further away, but it's odd that Arjuna is the furthest away. Now, you would not imagine that Draupadi, who's supposed to be closest to Arjuna, is actually as far away from him as anyone could expect. And he said, okay, something's wrong. We made a mistake. We cut the data in a variety of different ways. We tried practically every single algorithm that we could think of to look at the proximity, and every way it came out that Arjuna and Draupadi are the furthest away. I said, okay, that makes no sense, until we met an investment banker in Pune who said, don't you know that there's a Marathi play on this topic? On what topic? See, Arjuna and Draupadi, see, the epic mentions that Draupadi likes Arjuna. Not Arjuna likes Draupadi. He had enough people to command his attention. And this play is about how she felt completely ignored by him. And this play is in turn based on a Bengali play. So you are just rediscovering what we've known for some time. Okay. Data can tell me about the Mahabharata. What kind of a joke is that? This we did not expect, and we're more surprised than most things. But what we've been doing in all of this was really just one thing, exploring numbers and statistics. And if there's one thing that I've learned, statistics can be even more fun than politics. I wish you only one thing, have fun with data. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. Clearly the most entertaining presentation of the day. All right, can we get some questions from the audience?
Sorry, you did have a question. I'll repeat the question.
No, we'll just give him the mic so the rest of the hall can hear. Don't worry about it.
Sorry, in the date chart that you had for the date of births, you had some data on June 31st. So is it officially fudged poorly, or is it just, so if you flash back to
No,
that
you
slide.
actually, we actually had February 29th and 30th marked
Yeah.
in red. No, that is just my mistake.
Okay.
For dates that don't exist, I put in a 0 and should have just made it blank. So
Got it,
we had dark red instead of white. Yeah. No, nobody actually had February 30th as a real birthday. Not that bad yet.
Any other questions? Okay, Anand, you know the saying about lies, damn lies, and statistics,
Yep.
right? So there's one thing I've always noticed with people who use data, and Rajdeep in his previous presentation when asked what is your opinion, he said it's not my opinion, it's what the data says. Can data hide the truth? Because data scientists always say that data tells the truth. And we know data can hide the truth just as well.
Absolutely.
So tell us some of the ways in which you can use data and reach the opposite conclusions of what you've reached.
Take the stock market growth. I have put together one slide where I can clearly show that the stock market has been growing very steadily over the last, this is not right now, the past period, has been growing very steadily over the last 6 months, which is true. Except that this is on a scale that probably represents 0.2% or 0.5% of the entire fluctuation of the stock market in general. Right. So if I expand the scale, what looks like a steady growth actually becomes like practically a flat line. So I can fudge the axis. I can change the scale going back to 20 years, and then what looks like a steady growth suddenly becomes a steady decline. Basically, you tell me the answer you want, and I will find the data to fit it. And this is all correct data, absolutely no problem. Data is like any other technique, a tool that can guide you. How well you want to be guided by it, how open you are to critique is entirely your choice. The best example was when we were working with this is recorded, right?
You want us to switch off the mics? No problem, we'll switch it off.
No, let's go on.
Or say controversial things and
So
see
the-
what happens.
Ministry of Finance, we had a discussion, and we were forecasting the budget. And the budget data showed that, in fact, I have the semi-anonymized results. I can show it to you. So, MOF budget. Yeah. So, we were effectively looking at, for each of these ministries, let's take a look at the data. Let's take Ministry of Civil Aviation. What is the actual budget trend? This is almost real data, just truncated and stuff like that. The budgeted amount was also increasing, but the deviation between the actual and the budgeted was increasing, and we were forecasting it to increase. So we had forecasts like this, and for the Ministry of Coal, we found, this is in fact true, that the actual amount of money that they are spending is less and less, and we expect it to be less. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Just can you put it on the screen? Laptop feed on the screen.
I'll keep talking in the meantime. So we found that the Ministry of Coal had more and more budget every year and was spending less and less. The gap was constantly widening. So we went to the Ministry of Finance and said, look, here's a case there to be made. You just go back to the Ministry of Coal and tell them this doesn't make sense. So they looked at me very sweetly. Okay, let's see. What do you mean, let's see? Hold on. And then they took us out to dinner. And then they said, data is a weapon. This is not how you use it. Let them come with their budget estimates. Then we'll talk. Okay, at which point I got it. This is not stuff that you share with everybody. You use it at the strategic moment as a bargaining chip, especially when the data is available to you. No different from the information that has been with people. The people who have the data and the ability to make conclusions out of it are more powerful than those that are not. That does not necessarily guarantee them success, that does not necessarily guarantee them wisdom, but data can be made to say whatever you want.
At every tech conference, Anand, you hear the same cliche that data is the new oil, right? Is data the new oil? And not all oil is of the same quality. There's high quality oil and there's oil with lots of pollutants in it. So is data the new oil, and what are the different kinds of data that one can get, the different kinds of new oils that you can get?
They use the term in the sense that oil effectively ushered in a big portion of the industrial revolution, and data is to a big extent ushering the revolution of machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's a prerequisite. The idea that machines can beat humans or at least replace humans in a number of tasks is based on the assumption that machines can be trained with sufficiently large quantities of data. So the more data you generate, the more you can train machines and the more effective they become, and that is definitely happening. So the promise is turning into reality, there's no question about it. The trouble though is, are we able to, actually no, I take that back. No, there is no trouble. And we will have a lot of teething issues. We do have a lot of teething problems. Some data is very amenable to this. Image data, for instance. Until 10 years ago, we could do nothing with image data. Today, you can easily identify who a person is. We can classify a species of fish. We can classify a species of plant. We can figure out how many trucks are rolling past an Indian Oil petrol pump and what percentage of them are coming inside. We can see how many people are turning towards a monitor and therefore measure the effectiveness of an ad that has been displayed in a billboard. All of these are happening today. And some kinds of data where, for example, there was this bank in the Middle East that came to us and said, we want you to forecast our sales next year. Okay, what data will you give me? They said, we have the last 3 years sales data. Okay, daily data? No, annual data. So you're going to give me 3 data points and you want me to forecast the 4th data point. I said, yeah. So well, there is a certain amount of lack of understanding of what can and cannot be done. But the reality is that there is so much more data available today. And there is now the possibility of monetizing and making use of unstructured data, images, text, audio, video, that, the exceptions are probably the 0.1%. Data is the new oil.
And back to the audience. Any questions? Should I see some hands up? Yeah. Yes, sir. Go ahead. Just wait for the mic.
As a data scientist, how do you look at regulation like GDPR? Does it make your job harder or easier?
Harder, but I guess the intent is to make it harder. And I guess the question behind it that you're asking is that good for the society or not? I don't know. I'm not a spokesperson for society. I'm a data scientist. As a data scientist, I hate regulation. I want your data. I don't care how private you think it is. If I could hack into your telecom data and figure out exactly whom you called, I would just hack into it. I couldn't care less. But obviously, there is a responsibility to society. Fortunately, society is pretty good at deciding these sorts of things. And the European Union has made it more expensive, certainly for European firms and partly also for firms outside of the European Union to innovate, which means that the larger firms are going to be at an advantage. But it does mean that some of the protections that citizens did not have are going to be increased. Is that a good thing? I don't know, but I can comfortably say that it's made data scientists' life much more of a nightmare than it otherwise was.
Anand, have you done, you've done some work with CNN IBN on, have you done any analysis of the words that news anchors use, breaking, exclusive, corruption, Modi, Rahul? Have you done any such analysis?
I don't, okay, as you could have probably seen, I'm not necessarily the most politically correct person, but let me try. So recently when a famous anchor moved channels, the channel that he moved out of asked, look, can we do an analysis of their mannerisms, of their words, and can we identify whether this can be reproduced? Are there certain behaviors, are there certain gestures, are there certain styles, words that can actually be successfully used? That actually led to a stream of thought. So what we found was that firstly you need a hell of a lot of data, and we didn't in that particular instance have data. But then we work with Star TV fairly closely, and Star TV, along with various other channels, practically every channel does this. They actually have this kind of information for television serials. So they know for every 10-second interval, 15-second interval, whatever, who are the characters, what costumes they wear, what kinds of scenes are there, what's the mood, what's the background, all of this information. And we know the TRP for each of these. So the question is, are there certain kinds of behaviors that are actually more successful? And we found yes. So there is this serial called May I Come In Madam, where the lead character Sanjana is appreciated in practically every costume, except when she wears jeans. Short answer, avoid jeans. What really gets TRP ratings? Dream sequences. We find that when a show ends on a certain note, the audience that looks forward to the next show typically prefers the show to be ending on negative emotions, sadness, anger, unhappiness of some kind, except in Gujarat and Rajasthan, where they want it ending on a happy note. Otherwise, they don't watch the next episode. So you can do regional targeting this way. Can we figure out stuff like this? Oh yeah, we can.
Let's talk about some of the dark uses of data. When the Cambridge Analytica episode hit, for instance, some of us felt Facebook uses my data and tries to sell shoes to me or tries to sell clothes to me. What's wrong in trying to sell a politician to me? What's the moral difference in using that kind of data for political advertising versus just regular advertising? So did Cambridge Analytica and firms like that do anything wrong legally, or did they do anything wrong morally?
You're asking a person who knows neither law nor perhaps has a good sense of morals when it comes to data science. I don't know. I really don't know. Can they do it? Absolutely. Is it cool to do? Totally. Should it be done? I don't know. Somebody had better therefore just stop data scientists from doing cool things like this if it's supposed to be a bad thing. I have no idea.
No idea. All right. All right, last chance to ask Anand any deep, dark, disturbing questions. Merle, yes?
Does Gramener work with any political parties, number one? And if you do, are they seeking real insights from your data mining, or do they want you to wag the dog?
His answer is going to be no in either case, no?
The answer to the first one is no. But what they're seeking is actually simple stuff. The ones that we have been helping, if not working with, in the sense that no political party has. We've never taken up a project with a political party. Not that we would mind or anything, but it's complicated. What do they ask for? Simple things. See, the questions are, we have a candidate who's going to be speaking at a number of locations. What should they speak about? If, for instance, there is a scheme from the government that is working really well in a particular area and the candidate is the sitting MLA or MP, then we in those areas want to talk more about that scheme. So can we join the data about the demographics of the region and the performance of the schemes and find out what we should be talking about as areas of interest? This is a fairly common question. Now, is this a good or a bad use of data? I don't know, but it seems like a reasonably straightforward thing. At the very least, this is public information. It's tough to get, but it is public information. With an RTI or a series of RTIs, you'll be able to get this information and figure this out oneself. And in the process, if we put this information out in the public and everybody can benefit, even better. But that's the kind of stuff people are looking at right now. They're just learning. In fact, Cambridge Analytica has had one great fallout, which is that people now see that data can do interesting stuff. And a lot of the push from the government, from the likes of Niti Aayog and others, is to try and get people aware that data can be used very effectively in governance. A scandal like this does that pretty effectively. They say, oh, data can do dark things, and oh, by the way, maybe I'll get some good stuff done also. The bad stuff can be prevented, and over time it will. The good stuff is what we want to get a movement on, and I'm seeing that parties and the administrators are getting a lot more data savvy these days, partly thanks to some of the bad and partly thanks to a lot of the good work that's been done around data. So yeah, it's good stuff happening as well.
All right, Anand, thank you very much for that illuminating presentation.